Good morning. I don't know where to, I'll probably have to pace. I'm not in anyone's way. A little closer? Right there. Yeah. My voice tends to slide down. I inherited that from my dad, I think. He was, put him in front of anyone and he was way more soft spoken than he was in person. But my name is Katie Gray Brown, and I teach philosophy and peace studies at Manchester University.
Good morning, and my name is Livy Krebs, and I am serving as the Peace Studies Coordinator for the university this year.
And the Peace Studies Coordinator position is something that we've had at Manchester since 1992. Sean Kirshner was the first Peace Studies Coordinator, and it started as a one-year internship for a recent Peace Studies graduate to work on capacity building, just to help with the program. But it's been like one of our best exports. Programs around the country are envious of Manchester's position in this capacity because it allows us to hang on to some of our best talent for another year to really help with all pieces of the program. So Libby graduated a year ago, almost, and has been working full-time in peace studies with student organizations to help us bring speakers to campus and to help on these off-campus experiences too. So I'm really fortunate to have her as a colleague. This crowd knows my standard introduction about peace studies. And you probably also know that this is the 75th anniversary of the Peace Studies program at Manchester, the first of its kind anywhere. And we have that, I don't think we have it in print, but a verbal confirmation from Johann Galtung, who is the world's sort of most renowned peace researcher. He said, yeah, Manchester was pretty much first in the game for about 20 years. This was the only place in the world that had an undergraduate peace studies program. And that was all because of the vision of Dan West and Gladys Muir. Okay? Dan West, who volunteered in spring of 1947, I believe, to teach one seminar called The Bases for Enduring Peace. And it was popular, probably because it was just Dan West at that time, right? He had the ability to bring along a lot of people with his enthusiasm and his vision. And he convinced Vernon Schwalm that there was a need for Manchester to develop this program. And this was something that the college had heard before, right? In the 1930s, the Denominational Commission on Christian Education had assigned each of the Brethren colleges to the task of specializing in what they called Brethren values. So I think, I forget, I have it written down, what the different colleges drew. One of them drew biblical interpretation, one of them drew home economics, and Manchester drew peace. This was in the 1930s. And when Dan West in 1947 was urging Manchester to do such a thing, Gladys Muir heard about his work and wrote an essay called The Role of the Brethren Colleges in Preparing Young Men and Women for Peace Leadership. And it's a delightful and, it's such a compelling piece, because in this, she says, the problem of the 20th century, and she's writing this in 1947, and the problem of the 20th century is we've made all of this technological advancement, but not the moral advancement that we need to use it wisely. And she said, the role of Brethren colleges is to provide that. And so when she established the program in 1948, She pulled together a curriculum that she thought would allow people that area of study. Lots of religion, lots of philosophy, lots of history. And in the Peace Studies programs that developed decades later, they were way more grounded in the social sciences than Gladys Muir had. So it's been a distinctive element of our program from the go. Now, there have been lots of changes since 1947, 1948. Through collaboration with sociologists like T.Q. Evans, there was an emphasis on racial justice. Paul Keller expanded the curriculum in developing conflict resolution and mediation courses. We had collaborators in history and political science. And since 1970, a real emphasis on getting out into the world through January session travel. Right. And we continued this in this past January by taking a group to Kenya. Let me say a little bit about how we developed it.
Yeah, so Katie likes to start the story by saying that we have an alumni, Angie Odermina, who actually was here during the same time that Katie was, as well as her brother. And for years, Angie has begged Katie to bring students to Kenya. Angie has done amazing work since she's left Manchester. She's worked with AmeriCorps. She has worked in Europe with immigrant communities, and she met her husband there and has moved to Kenya and has been there for about 20-ish years. And during that time, Angie has this energy. She just makes connections with people, and not just any people, but these amazing peace workers and peacemakers in Kenya. And together they had created this organization called Green String Network that is focused on unpacking trauma and cycles of violence and the experiences that a lot of people in Kenya were having due for repercussions of colonialization in this area for years. In fact, Kenya did not get independence until 1963. So they're a rather young country when it comes to independence. And having the ability to unpack that at a community level was very important, because they were seeing that practices that commonly are referred to as trauma-informed in the United States are very individualized, are very westernized, and do not apply to the context of these communities. And we're kind of leaving them without a space to do so that was appropriate and impactful with their cultural understanding and experiences within their communities. And so a lot of different peacemakers and Angie had seen this space that was open and needed to happen. And for years has been now working with Green String Network, or we call it GSN, because it's a bit of a mouthful, has been working with GSN and had been seeing the work that had been happening and wanted Manchester to see that as well. And I think a lot of that has to do with the fact that the grassroots organization and the community-based organizing is a little different from some of the things that we might see in the United States, but still resonate, especially with young scholars who are opening their minds to what peacemaking can look like. And so that was kind of the inspiration behind why did we end up in Kenya? It was pretty amazing.
Kenya was also a good fit because of a collaboration on campus that has been developing over the last 3 years between peace studies and environmental studies. Now, these programs were developed along the same Manchester model of you look at the resources you have and you try to adapt them to work together to allow students to really examine and explore this critical area of interest. And so the environmental studies program developed after the first Earth Day in 1970 along similar interdisciplinary lines as the Peace Studies program. But the cultures of the programs have been very different. And there hasn't been a lot of overlap. In fact, until about 4 years ago, the only thing that brought environmental studies and peace studies together has been one class, environmental philosophy. And there were a lot of arguments in that class between peace studies people and environmental studies people who really thought more about like science and conservation rather than working in sort of social action movements. But that has changed with the growing awareness and understanding of the climate crisis. And increasingly, we have been doing more and more together so that now we have a healthy overlap of students who are majoring in both peace studies and environmental studies. And this trip, we thought, this is exactly in that intersection. As we knew that we would be visiting areas that have been immediately affected by climate change, and speaking with refugee communities who are in their situation, have been displaced because of climate issues. And we were going to be meeting with someone and their organization who has been working on what to do with communities with people who are in these situations. So our first days at the Green Stream Network in Nairobi were getting acclimated to being in East Africa, but also an introduction to the GSN framework, like what it means to focus on healing-centered. And some of you may know that McKnight approach of asset-based community development, and healing-centered trainings were very much in that model, like looking at the capacities and the resiliency that people have in order to generate solutions to current crises.
Yeah. During those first couple of days, we actually had an opportunity to walk through some of the curriculum that GSN has developed over time with the very people who developed that curriculum. So we spent a lot of time walking through activities that they would use in their curriculum in different programs. There were two main programs that we focused on. One was Kumakucha Quest. That one is focused on any age group, but has typically been used with young adults and youth as well. And it's focused on storytelling, on improv, on dialogue circles as the space for communication. Another program that we had learned about was Healing the Uniform. This one was focused on the Kenyan National Police and helping them navigate the trauma that they may have experienced as perpetrators or victims of violence. And they have a very tight-knit relationship, actually, with the Kenyan police force, which is very interesting, and have also been active within their prison system as well. So we had learned a little bit about both of those and got to walk through those processes together. And I think those experiences were very valuable for everyone involved. It was one of those moments where you get to take what you've been learning in the classroom and get to apply it in a different context, and students were very open to it. Even though we went through over 2 days worth of workshops, they were engaged every single day, which kind of speaks to the quality of this curriculum. We had been in Nairobi for the first couple of days, and then we traveled to Isiolo County, which you can tell is kind of in the middle of Kenya. And while we were there, we met with the Regional Pastoralist Peace Link. And this was a great example of that collaboration that Katie spoke to between peace studies and environmental studies. Because this organization focuses on how pastoralist communities, so communities that are entirely reliant on the animals that they raise for income, for food, everything, and how that can be impacted by the climate crisis, and how it can influence conflict within these communities because they're competing for the scarcity of resources. This was an incredibly impactful experience for me, especially because getting to sit down with them and hear their processes, they had very strategically looked at all of the challenges that were impacting those communities and had built different ways to different strategies to work with those conflicts. And they had taken their data and their information and were very, very systematically looking at how those strategies were impacting the conflict. And I think this was one of the first organizations that I had seen do so effectively, and to also see it be led by incredibly powerful women was really, really amazing.
Yes, you might be able to see through the red outlines of Isiolo County. There's a river that runs through it, and that river originates at Mount Kenya and then winds to the northeast. And we drove sort of along the route of the river from high altitudes then down into this more arid and flatter region of Kenya. And we could see up in the highlands at the origins of the river, there were many, many farms, large farms with greenhouses that were mostly, we learned, devoted to growing crops for export. Flower crops, what were some of the others? It was a lot of flowers, green beans, evidently, that's a big Kenya export. And then as you went down, down, down in altitude, it got drier and drier and drier. And it moves from agriculturalists and farms of different sizes to pastoralists. So we got to the point where we didn't see a lot growing, but we saw lots of people herding camels and goats and cattle. Okay. But as outlined in this picture on the top right, where one of the organizers was demonstrating the flow chart of consequences when, say, the river dries up more quickly, and people have to take their camels farther and farther in order to get adequate grazing, and then that encroaches upon other people's traditional grazing grounds. So there are all of these different conflicts that come from some of these smaller changes in climate patterns that this group is trying to negotiate.
Oh my gosh, we didn't. Well, I'll back up. I mean, you've seen this slide, but we'll keep talking about it. So while we were in Isiolo, we met with the Regional Peace Link, and then we also met with a local natural resources authority. And the experiences of those two different organizations was very different. But one thing they did have in common was a collaboration between the two that was called the Camel Caravan. And this had been one of those choice strategies to bring this conversation from their organization out to the local communities. So the Camel Caravan was a 6-day event that happens every year, I believe, where people and camels walk up the river that is the biggest source of water for this area, from the lower flatter lands up to those higher elevation lands that Katie had been talking about, where a lot of the predominant agriculture and cultivation of plants had been happening. And along the way, they stop and they have meals with local communities. They have conversation. It's a way to bring not just the communities together, but start talking about all of the things that impact them related to climate change, related to their relationship with one another as they move up the river. And as they move up the river, they can also see the dramatic change of what's happening, of who is most impacted by the scarcity of the water and who has the most access to it. And it's very, I don't know, it's one of those things that you can tell is now become such a ingrained part of the work that they do, because not only is it something that they're incredibly proud of, but there seems to be a lot of product out of it, a lot of conversations that have continued and people who have grown part of this movement together.
Yes, and that's one of the areas where GSN and the Isiolo Pastoralist Peace Link, they facilitate conversations among members of the 42 different tribal communities in Kenya, right? Because we have a nation state that has been designed along colonial ideas, not traditional tribal areas or homelands, right? And so there are all of these different complicated political conflicts that arise because these are communities that have been drawn together through the process of decolonization. And we saw animals. Oh, we saw animals that growing up in North Manchester, I never imagined I would ever see in person. And we were at a relatively small reserve. It didn't feel small, but it was a relatively small reserve. And to my shock, I had ideas of what going on a safari might be like. This was not like that. I don't know. I know some of you have been on safaris, and so maybe you had the same experience the first time. But we had driven from Nairobi in these vans, in these passenger vans. You see one there with the elephants. And on the morning of our safari, we got up and we loaded into our vans, and then the vans just drove into the reserve over these roads that were deep sand, sometimes getting caught in the sand, and navigating their ways around quietly these groups of elephants that would be in the road. It was so awesome to look out over the distance. And we were told, it's so green here. It is so green because even though it was January and should have been gone into the dry season, Nairobi experienced floods the first week we were there. Right? Again, an indication of these changing weather patterns. So our hosts were remarking on how green all of these pictures are. And sometimes it was more difficult to see the animals because of the greenery. But we could look out over the trees, those beautiful acacia trees, and see the long necks of the giraffes as they were walking by. And to just see these animals that I had seen in zoos, but in their free environment doing their lives was amazing. And so all of our students just came back from that day with huge eyes and elevated blood pressure because it was such an exciting experience that for many of us, we never imagined we would actually be able to do. And remember, how many of our students had never been out of the United States. Most of them, I think, had been on planes, but for many students, they got their passports for this trip and had this experience because Manchester organized it for them.
And just to add to this, I think this part of the trip was, again, another reminder of how amazing it is to have peace studies and environmental studies students. Obviously, these animals are amazing and gorgeous and incredible, but as someone who is not a science person, I get to look at the giraffe and like, ooh, giraffe. But to hear the environmental studies students around you go, oh my gosh, this is the thing we've been talking about. Or, for example, in this past picture, we saw a lot of different types of antelope. And we saw one type of antelope that the name is completely going out of my brain, but there had been a genetic mutation in their community, and so they had double sets of ears on both sides. I know. And my brother was there. He's like, oh my gosh, and this is why, because of this thing and this thing and this thing. I was like, cool. Like, I would never have been able to have that into context. And so it was a really great example of, especially for the environmental studies students, to see something that, again, you would never have imagined seeing in your life and then being able to talk about it. And we also got to talk with someone who was a ranger there and was an ecologist, I believe. working within that reserve and had been there for a very long time. And so they got to ask the questions that they had been thinking about throughout that entire trip. And so that was really amazing. I also want to point out on this far, I guess this your right side of the slide, these are actually pictures from Karura Forest, which we visited in Nairobi. It is actually a forest that is part of the legacy of Wangari Maathai, who was an environmentalist who was from Kenya, studied in Kansas, which is crazy, but came back and started the Green Belt movement, which was a movement of particularly women within Kenya preserving natural spaces in Kenya. And this is one of the biggest spaces that remains within Nairobi. And we got to see, you can see our pictures with our hands in the sky. This is the second largest tree in Nairobi. It was so big, but there was also I feel like a bit of magic to that place. Not just because we got to hear more about her legacy through the eyes of the GSN team and some of the peacemakers who were with us, but to be able to contextualize that, especially after we had been traveling in a rather urban area for a while, for a couple of days. It was a very magical experience, I think. After we were in Isiolo County, we moved then to the tiniest little corner of Kenya. And this is Kwale, or also near Mombasa, on the coast. And we were there for about 3 days. And we actually were there with Samba Sports, who is a partner with GSN, who is using the curriculum that is Kumakucha Quest. And our first day there, we got to learn about the organization and all of the different projects that they are doing. They use sports, arts, technology, basically anything that young adults would be interested in as this vehicle for conversation around peace, as well as the same things that we have been learning about GSN. We were seeing it in practice with an organization that had been using it for, I think, a couple of years now. And I have played soccer for most of my life. So this was one of my favorite places to be because it was a great example of what teams can do to lift people up. And I especially liked the picture in the bottom left here, where all of these different phrases, I want to read a few of them on. Soccer is not about the insults, it's about connection. My coach protects me from risks in my life. The pitch is my peace. And so they use lots of different ways to encourage young people to be having tough conversations. During that first day, we also got an opportunity to walk through one of the dialogue circles that they use with youth. And that was a really great opportunity because up to this point we had talked about it, but hadn't really gotten able to do it. And the people who were leading that dialogue circle had actually been people who had been part of Kumakucha Quest when they were younger, and how now, what was they called? They called it beneficiaries. People who were beneficiaries who had seen and been part of that process and are now encouraging that process again with a new generation of youth. And so that was really, really incredible. I'm going to let you talk for a little bit because I could keep talking.
Yes. So at Samba Sports, part of this Kubakucha model is that you bring together people for games and for food, and then in the middle, break up to have a discussion circle about a question that gets them talking about their experiences and their families' experiences. So we would play games, you see that in the lower right-hand corner, and then break up, and they'd say, everybody get into small groups. List the things that cause stress in your community. And these young people, and you could see there were always, most of the people participating were from their late teens to late 20s, I think. some maybe a little younger than that. But then there were these groups of children that would gather around behind and watch everything. So they would hear like their older brothers and sisters and neighbors identify it's really hard when my mother loses her job, right? Economic lack is a big problem, and it causes stress in our community. Anxiety about whether or not I will be able to go to school, right? And or student loans. And they would list these out and realize, okay, we are all facing similar experiences. And then break up for another game, another activity. And then later come back and generate a question, who holds respect in your community? And so they think about, well, what does it mean to hold respect? And they list lots of people in different positions that you wouldn't maybe expect. But all of these activities really foster this sense of there are these very real pressures and traumas that challenge our homes and our communities. And yet we recognize that we have resources, maybe even in each other, that can confront these problems. So they included us in that day, and at the end of our activities, they broke us all into groups of 3, 1 Manchester person and 2 Kwale youth, and brought out a plate of food. It was wonderful biryani rice with goat curry in the middle. And they poured water over our hands, and we ate collectively with these young people. And it was a moment of just very vulnerable connection, eating food with your hands from a common plate, after talking about some of the challenges that you face in your life. The story of Kenya. So for many of our students, this was their first really significant travel abroad. For I think almost all of our students, this was the first experience of examining a post-colonial society that is still sort of navigating some of the damage of colonialism. And that lesson really hit home for many of our students, along with the importance of studying history, because these were stories that Kenyans knew from having lived it so recently, and our students didn't know this history. And were able to sort of discern, like, where is my country, where is the United States in this history, complicit or as an ally? Asante Sana, yeah. So some takeaways from this. Do you want to share? Yeah, there are lots of, first of all, and I mean, this crowd knows this story, that the importance of travel, I should have written it down, the Mark Twain quote about travel being the antidote to ignorance, or the antidote to any kind of lack of compassion, right? That there's nothing that is as good a teacher as traveling and meeting people other places. And as other schools, I think Huntington University, McPherson also just did away with their January session terms. And so we do not take lightly the privilege of having an institution that is structured in a way that we can do this, that allows this. And having finances that can help underwrite some of the students so that they can go. Travel is not inexpensive, even when you're staying with hosts and trying to keep costs low. But we're committed as a program to making that part of what our students can do.
Something that I forgot to mention at the beginning was that we had 4 members of the Green Screen Network team that were with us throughout the entire time that we traveled, and some of them were from parts of the country that we were traveling to, but some of them, this was also a very new space for them. So in addition to them having new experiences while we had new experiences, they were also very close in age to the students. The youngest one was the same age as me, and I think the oldest was in his 30s. And so the conversation that happened, not even at the places that we were visiting, but as we were traveling together, were so incredibly impactful. I kept laughing to myself. On other Jan terms that I've been with Katie, we usually have a dedicated time in the evening where we sit together and we talk about questions that we are having or coming up. But what we found was that throughout the entire trip, students were just asking questions all the time. And we're talking with the members of the GSN team and amongst themselves, and we're critically thinking even when we were in our downtime. And so I think that was an incredible space to be in. And I don't know if that was just because of the type of travel we were doing or the connections that we had as a group. But that was really, really incredible. And to have the time and the resources of their team to be with us was really, really impactful. I think also, I think especially as someone who had just graduated from the program, you go, yes, I have a degree in peace studies. I know things. Awesome. And then you go to a different country and it's all completely different. And that's amazing. Because I found that I was taking definitions that I had felt like I had defined for myself through 4 years of college, and they were kind of being turned on their heads. Like the definition of resilience was something that was definitely changing for me every single day. And even when we were in Nairobi, I was like, yeah, I got it. And then we moved to ECL though. No, I don't. No, I don't. I need to add another thing. And so I think I've heard similar things from students who were on this trip. I think this was a very great example of continuing to have an open mind, continuing to look for opportunities that will expand your own perspective, and always trying to think bigger, I think.
So 3 takeaways that I brought back among many. One is the power of a really good idea, the lasting power. And I mentioned this in some other conversations. I met 4 people named Kennedy, 4 men named Kennedy in their they were about 20 or 30 years old in that time frame. And there's this sort of, it was because when I asked, well, there's a memory of Kennedy in the Kennedy airlift that brought promising young people from Africa to study in the United States in the early 1960s. And I thought, that's just a small testament to a really good idea that helps share educational resources and promote development by investing in education. It was the program that Wangari Maathai came to Kansas through. The second was about this, the critical importance of combining the tools of peace studies and the tools of environmental science to address the problem of climate change and to understand the role of climate change in conflict around the world. And lastly, honestly, I thought of David Waz. I thought about the need for Africanists. We learned that by 2040, by the year 2040, 25% of the world will be African. I think 1 in 4 people will be living on the continent of Africa. And what percentage of those people will be under the age of 35, right? So Africa is the world's future. It's obviously the world's past, the world's future, and so many of the people that we will be working with in Africa are young people. So it's this period where an investment in understanding and connecting with Africa is so important. And I was thinking about it because right now, for the first time, maybe in 100 years, we have no Africanist at Manchester University. We have no one in political science or in history or in peace studies who has that as their area of expertise. And so one directive I think that we brought back was the urgency of developing that as a resource. Like we need to figure out as a peace studies program, as a university, how to keep that tradition alive at Manchester. So thank you for your attention and your interest in this. Are there questions that we could, what about language, right? Yes, well, the formal language of education system in Kenya is English as a holdover from being a British colony. So we had no language difficulties. In Kwale, there were people who were, because they hadn't had access to regular English education, there were some struggles, but everyone could communicate in English. Most people speak English, Swahili, and then their tribal language. They're trilingual in Kenya. And the young people, of course, speak what's called Sheng, which is a combination of English and Swahili, we were trying to learn some slang in Sheng. Yes.
I heard you right. You said there were differences in the way the West works with peace and the cultural milieu there. How could you say some more about that? What kind of differences?
Yes. So the cultural differences in a Western approach to peace building and a non-Western, or specifically East African approach.
Yeah, we talked about this a lot when we were there, but we also were given a lot of amazing literature from Angie before we came. And so I think that's where I got a lot of my foundation of this understanding. A lot, especially as someone who was trained as an educator, I had been used to this idea of trauma-informed techniques or curriculum. And often that is really focused on an individual and the trauma they have experienced, and then what do you do with that? And there's not as much of a process of really breaking down definitions, but also the experience of how that trauma may not just impact the individual, but it takes it to a community level. So it kind of takes what something is kind of narrowed down and pulls it out and brings out all these different perspectives. And that's the healing-centered peace building was the word that was used at GSN. And that takes that process of pulling it out and goes from the individual to your family, to your community, and it takes that conversation and centralizes it in the community, rather than where we see with Western approaches. It's often in the approaches of one-on-one, of like a counseling services, for example. It kind of, in some ways, takes it out of context. There's still a lot of amazing work that can happen in trauma-informed. Don't get me wrong. I think it's an amazing practice in pedagogy in lots of different ways. Healing-centered is kind of giving another option, another space of saying, where are your support systems? How are you plugging into that, and how are they plugging into you? And how can we have that conversation together? It's a lot more holistic, I think, is a really good term. And that often is so important in the context, especially of East Africa, when there are so many different factors at play. It often isn't just the individual's trauma, but it's also the impact of the climate crisis, access to basic needs. All of those things layered on top of each other are important to take in into context when talking about these things. So I think holistic is a good term when talking about the differences between the two. Does that answer your question? Okay.
What you were sharing there, it just seems like we in the United States could learn a whole lot along that line.
Yes, yeah. Roger says that what Libby was just saying sounds like something that could work here too. Yes, absolutely. That's what we thought as well.
Do you have any African Americans with you?
Did we have any African Americans with us? No, we had, it was not an entirely white group, but we had no African Americans.
How many students?
We had 11 students and then 3 recent alumni who were staff at Manchester and 1 older alum, my brother Michael. And then Anuj Gurung, who's the Peace Studies professor, and then me. 17 all in all.
Seems like with the Church of the Brethren and all our connections in Nigeria, that there'd be a whole lot of similar kind of dynamics that we were saying in Kenya and similar in Nigeria.
Yes, so Roger's saying with the Church of the Brethren connections in Nigeria, it seems like there would be similar projects or similar work happening there.
I think especially, I have a friend who's in Nigeria, Sharon Flatten, and a lot of her work is around youth and their exposure to extremist groups and what might be pulling them into those spaces. And we had very similar conversations, especially in Isiolo and Samba Sports, that were talking about a lot of how social media plays into that, as well as the lack of access to opportunity. I think a phrase that was used quite often is when youth are idle, they are susceptible. And so that's where we saw like Samba Sports as a great example of not only a space where they can have conversation, but Samba Sports also has their own soccer leagues. And so they have activities that are not just, you know, we're going to sit and talk for a bit, but are active extracurriculars. And so I think you're quite right. There's a lot of similar themes across the two.
And Isiolo in the past has been a center for recruitment for religious extremists. And that has ended in Isiolo. And the people with whom we met said, well, one of the reasons is people are drawn to religious extremism when they have no other avenue for helping their communities, when they feel like they are politically disenfranchised, they sense a loss of agency and a loss of hope. And all of the work that the Pastoralist Link organization is doing is encouraging people to recognize their agency and work together to help their communities. So they say there is no longer a problem with recruiting our young people.
Is there an exponential kind of way that that's happening in our country?
Is that happening in our country?
In an exponential way of why there's such a diversity and all, it sounds like there's maybe a big gang effort in here.
Yeah. I think that there are certainly places of comparison. I think if we want to say, well, if we step back in general, why are people drawn to extremism? And yet I want to honor the particular trauma of a colonized country, right? That places in this country, we see that very real. There are communities that are living out the trauma still of post-colonial existence. But here you have an entire nation that is like coming to terms, as Libby says, with their independence and with hierarchies that were established under the history of colonialism.
I find myself drawn to the word awesome because the planning, the envisioning, and what has actually been done, a fantastic experience for those students. And I just want a word of congratulations for the whole concept and the way in which it was carried out. What a wonderful contribution to the curriculum, to the students' lives, and to Manchester. Congratulations.
Well, yeah, we've had some great role models blazing this trail for January travel. So we're inspired to keep it up, even as we're finding it harder and harder. Fewer and fewer of our students are studying away for a semester or for a year. In previous generations, it was not uncommon for someone to spend a year abroad. And we are finding now that even our best students that in a previous generation, it would have been an assumption that they would go away for a long time, are finding it harder and harder to do. Now, the reasons for that are pretty complicated. There are lots of reasons that are leading to that result. But it makes us feel more committed to these January sessions where students might not even be able to imagine. We had, as you can imagine, parents and students who were anxious about going to East Africa. Even with everything that has happened in Gaza and in Israel since October, there were real questions about that. But these short-term trips are a way to give people a confidence that they can be uncomfortable and it will be okay. And that's a real tension that as group leaders we navigate, is the need to take care of people and to provide a context for them, and to make sure everyone's okay, but then also to make sure that they're uncomfortable too, that they experience that. Yeah, Jeanette's laughing. Yes, that's what I delight in, making people uncomfortable. But it is probably, it is probably the most powerful thing that I do as a teacher.
I have to say, like, one of the proudest moments that I had post-trip was this realization of, oh, we're building this capacity within our students to be uncomfortable and to see the value in that. I think it was like the first week we were back from class, we were standing in our Peace Studies lounge, and one of our professors, I'm sure you might be familiar with her, Dr. Beata Galear, had walked in and had seen, oh my gosh, 3 people who had been in Kenya, please come talk to my class. So we had an impromptu presentation. And after we had been asked a couple questions, one of the students asked, like, do you recommend going on a trip to Africa specifically, but do you recommend going on a trip? And one of our students responded, if you are okay with being uncomfortable, then absolutely. But if you don't see yourself as one of those people, then maybe don't come on the trip. And she was kind of joking, but I think it was a great example, especially of this kind of legacy that we've started to instill, I think, especially since a previous Jan term just last year, where we had students who were underclassmen go with us to Florida, and we had some hard conversations and some challenging dynamics. But even after all of that, they enjoyed it so much that they wanted to go with us to another country. And these same students have now inspired our new freshmen who, as soon as we came back to the country, went, okay, so when's your next Jan term? We'd like to go. Can you tell us where to sign up? And so it's this really exciting thing, especially as someone who, I feel like I grew up in the program now, to see that love and that excitement for the uncomfortable, to be inspired in students. And I think that is incredibly exciting.
Thank you. No,